Now, I will be discussing now today the spinal cord. And within the spinal cord, we will be doing the ascending tracts and the descending tracts also. But the first presentation is with the ascending tracts. And you know how to draw the transverse section already. So I will be giving a little outline and a review of that transverse section of the spinal cord and main objectives. The first, we will discuss the lateral and anterior spinothalamic tract, and the rest of the fasciculus, gracilis, creatus, and anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts also. Now, this is the section of the spinal cord which you see in the histology, and you have been doing it in the first year. And you all know that there is a gray matter and there is a white matter, right? Can you hear me clearly? Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you. Yeah. Right, this is the white matter here, and this is the central gray matter. And the gray matter in the spinal cord is in continuity, which breaks up as it ascends in the brain stem, and the nuclei, they get scattered all out. Now, the gray matter is actually made up of what? You're going to tell me. Yes, Irtaza, can you tell me what is the gray matter? I'll ask few questions and just move on because you have done this. Yes, Irtaza, Saad, Umar, what is a gray matter? It is made up of what? ये शुएब, ये सारे उमर और हुसैन सब सो रहे हैं?
Ma'am, collection of cell bodies. No,
Yes.
ma'am, I'm here.
Good. That's it. All right. So it's the collection of the cell body. This is the neuron, which is actually forming the whole of your central nervous system. It has a body, right? This is the cell body. The collection of cell bodies is in the gray matter. And these are smaller processes, the dendrites, and this is the long axon. And these axons are forming the nerve fibers, and these processes, they are in the white matter, right? So यही जो neuron है, that is collected here in the gray matter. And the main type of neuron in the gray matter in the spinal cord, they're all multipolar neurons. They are neurons in the posterior gray horn. This is the posterior gray horn. This is the anterior gray horn. And this is the lateral horn, which is in the thoracolumbar region, where there is the autonomic outflow. The rest of the parts of the spinal cord, they're just the anterior and the posterior gray horn. This is the sensory horn, posterior horn, and this is the motor horn, which is the anterior horn. The sensory information comes here. The sensory nerve fibers enter here into the posterior horn and gives it through the internential neurons information to the motor neurons in the anterior horn, and then they pass out from here the motor nerve, and they both the sensory and the motor nerve, they're forming the a spinal nerve, and they are just moving, and the motor fibers are leaving and the sensory fibers are entering into it. And this is the thoracolumbar outflow, which is only supplying the autonomic nerve fiber. All contains the multipolar neurons. And this is what the lateral white column, the posterior white column, and the anterior white column. And the connecting zones are the anterior commissures, right? The connecting zones, the anterior commissure and the posterior commissure, right? These fissures are in posterior median fissure, this is the anterior median fissure. The pia mater is the membrane which is immediately surrounding it. Then there is the arachnoid matter, and then there is the dura matter. The neurons which are present in the posterior horn, all are sensory neurons, and different types of sensations, they're carried by these neurons. You have done this. I'll just name and list, and we will discuss these with the different types of the tracts. Now, the neurons, the first which are present at the apex of the posterior horn here, which you have drawn in the spinal cord also here, is the substantia gelatinosa, right? And it is present throughout the length of the spinal spinal cord mainly carries the pain and temperature sensation. Now, I will be asking you which type of neurons will be stimulated when the pain and temperature is being carried out. When the touch or 2 point discrimination is been carried out, then what is the type of the neuron which is receiving this information, right? So pain and temperature in touch by substantia gelatinosa. The nucleus proprius is also present through the spinal cord. It is taking 2 point discrimination, proprioception, and vibration sense, right? And the nucleus dorsalis or Clark's neurons, this is the two names. The thoracic, they are present in the thoracic and lumbar region, carry the proprioceptive impulses from the muscle spindle, right? The neuromuscular and the tendon spindles which are present in the muscles, and visceral afferent nucleus is also present in thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. All right. Now, the tracts which are present in the white column, they are either ascending or they are descending, right? The ascending tracts, they start from the spinal cord and they reach the central nervous system. They will pass through the spinal cord, they ascend through the brainstem and reach the cerebral cortex. And the descending fibers, they start from the cerebral cortex and they descend through the brainstem and reach the spinal cord. All right. So this is the basic concept of ascending, and all ascending tracts are the sensory tracts, and all descending tracts are motor tracts. ठीक है, इतना concept ठीक है. So I have now told you that there are different columns in the white matter: anterior column, posterior column, lateral column, and you are generally asked, write the tracts which are present in the anterior column, write the tracts which are present in the posterior column, like this. And the white matter mainly consists of their nerve fibers, as you know, and in addition to this, there are neuroglial cells, which are the sporting cells, right? And of course, there are blood vessels present in between. Now, this is the section of the spinal cord, which I hope you have memorized by this time. Now, the ascending tracts have been labeled on one side, and the descending tracts on the other side, although they are present on the both sides. But the section they draw generally like this, so that they are not mixed, and it's easy to memorize the things. Right? This is the posterior white column. This is the lateral white column. This is the point where the motor nerve root is leaving, and this is where the sensory nerve root is entering. So between the sensory and motor nerve roots, this is the lateral white column, and this is the anterior white column, right? So the first you should know the boundaries of this part is the posterior part, right? The posterior to the posterolateral, the posterior where the posterior roots are entering, and here the motor roots are leaving. The lateral white column, the anterior white column, and posterior white column. The posterior white column contains fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. Gracilis on the medial side and the cuneatus on the lateral side. And then in the lateral white column, there is anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts, and there is a lateral spinothalamic tract. And this is spino-olivary here, and spinotectal, the small ascending tracts. And in the anterior part is only the anterior spinothalamic tract. I will not enlisting the descending tracts yet. We will discuss this in our next class. Today, our main focus is on all these ascending tracts. So this is the general pattern, how the sensation is carried. This is a spinal nerve. This you have already done. I'm just quickly reviewing this thing. And the information passes through the sensory fibers in the spinal nerve. This blue is sensory fiber, which pass through this dilated zone, which is known as the dorsal root ganglia, or the spinal ganglia. Every spinal nerve has its spinal ganglia, right? So this is the dorsal root ganglia. So the sensations pass through the spinal nerve and they reach here. First relay station is the dorsal root ganglia, which is on the posterior side. Then they pass through the sensory root, which is the posterior horn. And this is the anterior horn. This is the lateral horn. The anterior horn, the motor fibers are in the red, and they are passing, these are motor fibers into the spinal nerve. But this is important to now understand, because I will be speaking out this, the dorsal root ganglia or the spinal root ganglia, which is forming the first relay station. Any impulse or any sensation, the pathways which they travel, they have to relay, right? And in the ascending tracts, there are three relay stations. ये वही है जैसे any relay game you play, और relay game में क्या होता है, you are holding any stick, and one person runs and give that stick to the next person, and then that person stops and the next one runs off, and like this. So there are three relay stations in the pathway of any sensations which are carried from the spinal cord to the cerebral cortex. uh, I hope everyone is awake. I would like you to discuss with me wherever you don't understand, and I'll ask the questions also, just to find out whether you have understood the things or not. So the ascending tracts we have already enlisted, and this is the list of the ascending tracts. And the receptors, these are Dr. Shakila have taken the detailed class on the receptors. They are receptors on outside of the body. From the outside, they are known as the exteroceptives, and from inside of body, the interoceptive receptors and the proprioceptive impulses, which are the impulses from the muscle and joint. They are the proprioceptive receptors. So any information that will be taken and will be carried by the receptors, and every tract has a specific sensation which is sensed by specific receptors, and they will travel in their specific tracts. So anterior white column tract, which is the anterior spinothalamic tract, carries pressure and light touch or crude touch. Light touch is with the cotton, you touch and you can feel the sensation. This is a light touch or a crude touch, right? The posterior white column which is the fasciculus gracilis inclinatus, is responsible for tactile localization, 2-point discrimination, vibratory sense. I'll explain this when I'll discuss the posterior white column. The lateral white column, which contains the lateral spinothalamic tract, which I want to discuss today, that is the main focus on it, will carry the pain and temperature sensation. So this was just a brief overview, which you have already discussed and done in the previous classes. Now today we will start first with the anterior and lateral spinothalamic tracts. The anterior spinothalamic tract is present in anterior white column, and lateral spinothalamic tract is present in the lateral white column. They run very close to each other and have almost the same root, but they carry different sensations. Anterior carries the pressure and light touch, and the receptors for pressure and the light touch or pressure receptors, they're different. The Meissner's and the Merkel's discs. The Meissner's and the Merkel disc, they are responsible for carrying this in. The lateral spinothalamic tract is responsible for pain and temperature sensation, and this is carried by the receptors, which are the free nerve endings present in this. A example is just a pin prick. If we just take an example that your finger has been pricked, right? The pain will travel through the free nerve endings, or it is pressed, your palm is pressed, a pressure is applied, will be taken by the Meissner's and the Merkel's receptors, and that will travel through anterior spinothalamic tract. So pressure and touch will travel through anterior spinal thalamic tract, and if it's the prick, it will travel through the lateral spinal thalamic tract. The sensations will be carried from the nerve fibers, spinal nerve, first to the dorsal root ganglia, spinal ganglia, which is the first order neuron, right? And then it reaches the posterior horn where it relays in the substantia gelatinosa in both the tracts, anterior and spinal thalamic tract, whatever the receptors are, whatever the sensation is, their first order neuron is same and the second order neuron is same. It's only the difference in the receptors which make the sensation change. Otherwise, they are traveling in this, and the fibers, of course, they are moving the lateral spinothalamic tract, that is moving from this posterior posterior horn, the sensory neuron substantial gelatinosa. It will cross over and will move into the opposite white column. I'll just zoom this. The lateral spinothalamic tract, the getting pain and temperature sensation, the first order neuron in posterior root ganglia, the second order neuron in the posterior horn where the substantia gelatinosa is there. The fibers, now the second order neuron fibers, they arise here and they cross like this into the lateral white column, right? They are crossing, and there's an oblique crossing. That's an important thing. I won't be able to, probably I had a whiteboard, I would have shown you that they ascend not at the same level, they are ascending obliquely, and as a result, there is a difference of 2 to 3 spinal segments. That's very important. When you will be, just remember at this moment, when we will doing the lesions, then you will get the concept of this oblique region. They are crossing over, they're crossed fibers, and they're moving in the opposite lateral spinal thalamic tract, right? So, and then they ascend, and they ascend in the spinal cord in the lateral white column, and likewise the anterior spinal thalamic tract that is carrying the pressure and touch will pass through this posterior root ganglia, which is the first order neuron, will pass into the posterior horn, into the substantia gelatinosa. Its fiber also cross, but they are moving into the anterior column. So the fibers, they are separate fibers and they're moving in separate columns, right? So they will move in the anterior white column as anterior spinal thalamic tract, and this will move as the lateral spinal, and both are ascending. Both are ascending and moving like this, and they're very close to each other. And as they ascend through the spinal cord, then they move through the medulla and pons, and then they join together. They don't mix, but they are very close to each other, like that they have joined each other. They see this vertical disposition here. This is the sections or the whole pathway of these tracts, right? This is the spinal cord, the brainstem here, and the cerebrum, right? And they have shown you the whole of this brainstem in the sections. The spinal cord here, the section of spinal cord. Then there's a medulla section here, right? The medulla is shown, the upper part of the medulla and the lower part of the medulla, there is a difference. And then there is a pons, then the midbrain, and then the cerebrum, right? So this is how they are ascending the lateral spinal thalamic tract and the anterior spinal thalamic tract. इसको मैं थोड़ा सा और zoom कर लूँ और आपको, ताकि मैं इसको ज़रा थोड़ी देर के लिए गायब कर देती हूँ. And I want this diagram to be highlighted more. All right, now you can see here the spinal cord section. This is the side, the receptors were on this side, right? So if the fibers, the pain sensation was that it's your right hand, which or right finger, which was pricked, right? The pain prick will travel through the pain and temperature receptors, and pain and temperature receptors, the free nerve ending, through the sensory part of the spinal nerve, will move into the dorsal root ganglia, which is on the posterior side, which is the first order neuron, will move into the second order neuron here, and the second order neurons, they are present here in the spinal cord, in the posterior horn, and then they cross over obliquely and they're moving into the lateral white column as the lateral spinothalamic tract, passing through medulla, into the medulla, right, into the pons, and into the midbrain, and then into the internal capsule, thalamus and internal capsule, and then into the cerebral cortex. See, they were laterally, and as they are ascending, they have moved towards the central zone, and then the third order neuron fibers, which are mainly in the thalamus. The third order neurons are in the thalamus. This is the ventroposterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, and then the final destination is the sensory cortex, which is the postcentral gyrus. All right. So this is the whole pathway which is of the lateral spinothalamic tract. The similarly the anterior spinothalamic tract, which is carrying the touch and pressure, that is also traveling posteriorly and then into the dorsal root ganglia, and from the dorsal root ganglia into the dorsal horn of the gray matter, where they go to the substantia gelatinosa. This is the first order neuron. Substantia gelatinosa is second order neuron. Then they cross over into the anterior gray matter, and they ascend like this in the anterior. And when they reach this part of the pons, they're very close to the lateral spinothalamic tract and join. And together, they are forming a lemniscus. Lemniscus is a broader band, right? They are fusing and they are forming a lemniscus, a sheet, and this is known as spinal lemniscus. In addition to the lateral spinothalamic tract, anterior spinothalamic tract, spinotectal tract also fuse at this level. So the spinal lemniscus is in the pons, which is actually the closed association, or it is the just if you just wrap these three bands in a ribbon, so a lemniscus is created. There is a lateral, there is an anterior, and there is a spinotectal, and this together is known as spinal lemniscus. And then this, in this, you can see a band here. And you call here the spinal lemniscus. This is the midbrain level. It is passing through the thalamus. This is the thalamus here, thalamus in this section, the thalamus, which is a third order neuron and which is the main nucleus of the thalamus. It's the VPL, the ventroposterolateral nucleus, and then they pass through the internal capsule, and from the internal capsule the fibers radiate, and these fibers are known as corona radiata, which separate out and they reach the final sensory area, which is the postcentral gyrus area 3 to 1. ठीक है जी, ये सारी कहानी जो मैंने भी आपको जुबानी यहाँ इसके ऊपर डायग्राम के ऊपर कराई है, दैट इज रिटन हियर. द पाथवे ऑफ द lateral spinothalamic tract, the first order neurons are in the dorsal root ganglion and the receptors are the free nerve endings, and the fibers, they reach the tip of the posterior gray horn. And this is an other important point जो मैंने अभी नहीं बताया था कि when the fibers they reach here in the posterior horn, in this diagram, just watch here. When the fibers reach here, as I said, they will relay in the substantia gelatinosa and then they cross over like this. Now, but some fibers, when they reach the tip here, they are ascending and they descend. They ascend and descend. These ascending and descending fibers, they form another tract which is known as posterolateral tract of Lesueur. This is the posterolateral tract of Lesueur, which is actually forming the connection between all the tracts which are arising at different levels, and they're interconnected also. Did you get this point? That each tract is arising from its spinal nerve. One is rising at this level, the second at this level, the third at this level, the fourth at this. So they need to have a connection between each other, and that is done by this posterolateral tract of Lesueur, which is the fibers which, when it reaches here, they are ascending and descending, and the connecting the different segments with each other. So the second order neuron fibers, they are in the substantia gelatinosa, in the posterior gray horn. They cross obliquely within one segment of the spinal cord and ascend in the opposite lateral white column. And within the pons, they are more posteriorly, and they join anterior spinothalamic and spinotectal tract, and together the three are going to form the spinal lemniscus, right? And then they pass through the midbrain as spinal lemniscus, and the region of the midbrain where they are passing is known as the tegmentum. These points are very important because these points can be highlighted in the MCQs. Third order neurons are in the thalamus, and which nucleus of the thalamus? It's the VPL, the ventroposterolateral nucleus, and then they pass through the internal capsule and its posterior limb, and then through the corona radiata into the cerebral cortex, the postcentral gyrus area 3 to 1. And the same is with the anterior spinothalamic tract. The receptors are for the pressure and the croup touch, and the first order neuron is same. Then the posterolateral tract of Lesueur is also formed. The second order neuron is again the substantia gelatinosa. They will cross and move into the anterior white column, and in the pons they will again join to form the spinal lemniscus, which is the same thing. And then the midbrain and the third order neuron into the thalamus, the VPL, then internal capsule, corona radiata, and the cortex. हाँ जी, यहाँ तक कहानी अगर ये सारी पढ़ी